totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Make sure you subscribe, give us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Author and NPR critic Tim Riley is our guest to talk about his prolific career as a music critic, author of several books on rock history, his brand new website, and latest venture, the Riley Rock Report, an audio newsletter which was launched in March. It builds on his book-length multimedia anthology of reviews due out in 2023, titled Millennium Pop, Music, Love, and Squalor. Over 100 essays covering the past 40 years. We start off with a website and then veer off into various discussions, including older rock artists playing youthful music for older audiences. Who gets it right? Who doesn't? Is there an expiration date for rock and roll musicians? The state of rock and roll radio today. The recent rock bio movie craze. Streaming services. The Beatles. And what we get wrong about the John Lennon and Paul McCartney partnership. Also, Tim has some strong opinions on Bob Dylan's recent music. All of that before we wrap things up with Tim's brand new digital project due out in 2023 that will take writing and reading about rock music to a whole new level. Tim Riley reviews pop and classical music for WBUR's widely syndicated Here and Now and On Point. He's written for the New York Times, Truthdig, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, Slate, Salon, along with many other publications. His television appearances include Morning Joe, PBS NewsHour, CBS Morning and Evening News, MTV, and the History Channel. Since 2009, he's taught digital journalism at Emerson College in Boston. To hear a playlist of the music we talk about in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Tim, thanks for being on the podcast. It's great to have you here.
It's good to be here.
So you've got this beautiful new website, which music fans can get lost in for hours, which is what I did. So much to get to here. What can listeners expect when they log on to timrileyauthor.com?
Well, I launched a new website because I had my fingers in a bunch of different pies, and I decided to just sort of put it all under one roof. And so I had been running this project for a long time called the Riley Rock Index because I really wanted a good reference resource guide as a music critic. And I just put together my own sort of link farm for that. And it kept growing and growing and growing. And that's been through a lot of iterations. I launched that in like 2008. But I'm more like a content guy and not a marketing guy. So I just sort of like did it for my own pleasure and just to kind of see if anyone would stumble onto it. And we did actually get a couple unsolicited notices from people saying they liked it and stuff. But, it's a pretty specialized area. So anyway, I just kept cultivating that. And then I did a podcast for a community radio station. Oh, this would be like 7 years ago. Roll Over Beethoven, the Rock Critic's Guide to Classical Music. So I wanted to get that in there. And then I have a new book project that I'm busy developing that have just been through a big iteration, and I'm starting a new iteration of it. And I wanted to sort of start showing excerpts of that because I decided what I'd do is serialize that in a newsletter. So the newsletter is the Riley Rock Report, and that's kind of tying in with the Riley Rock Index. And the newsletter is half serializing some chapters from this major compilation that I put together and half contemporary commentary on the way history inflects rock music today.
Yeah, and I want to get to that project that you have coming up. We'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to start with your podcast, Riley Rock Report, which is right on the website's main page. And
right.
I'm now a subscriber. Before I ask you about one particular episode, what is the Riley Rock Report for those who aren't familiar with it?
Right. So it's as a rock critic and as someone who teaches the history of rock and roll in my journalism classes, I'm very interested in music history and the way history and styles develop over time. And, one of the key questions that any music critic will ask is, so how did we get to this present moment? How do we arrive at the sounds that we're hearing today? And to me, that's a really fascinating question. And no matter where you join up with music history, if you dive in deep and start listening to big band jazz, or if you like to go back to the jazz singers, or if you want to listen to Broadway musicals, or if you want to start with Elvis, or if you want to go back to old R&B or old Lefty Frizzell country recordings. The music is really very welcoming wherever you put your foot in, and it'll carry you along. And I just find these different strands that weave together to help figure out how we arrive at today really, really interesting and really fascinating. So my argument is that anything you listen to today can be enhanced and deepened if you understand a little bit of history, right? And I think the more history you understand, the deeper your understanding of the current moment. So I've got 1 foot in history and 1 foot in the current moment, and that's the pitch for the Riley Rock Report. It comes out every other Fridays, and it's free, and it's one part a serialization of a bunch of clips that I have assembled from the past 40 years while I was working for the Phoenix and for NPR and for the New York Times and for the Los Angeles Review of Books. And it's one part contemporary commentary. So, for example, this week I'm going to actually do a contemporary essay on the 2 TV programs Gaslit and The Impeachment, which just aired as part of the 50th anniversary of Watergate. And I just found both of those programs so impressive and interesting in their approach and their angles. And as somebody who lived through Watergate, I wanted to comment on how both of those succeeding scandals are actually affecting the way we're looking at Watergate, and how the January 6th committee hearings right now are actually inflecting the way we think about Watergate. Watergate looks pretty mild compared to the throes of identity that this country is in right now. So I just found all of that was all piling up in my head, and I wanted to write about it. And, the good thing about these new platforms is I do a lot of pitching, and I sell book reviews, and I still am active in that area. But when I want to just sit and write about a TV show, I don't have to pitch it to somebody. I can just throw it into my newsletter. So that's why I like to do that. Yeah.
One particular episode that caught my attention is titled Roger Daltrey Turns 78 Before He Gets Old. And I believe this went up in late February, right, to celebrate the upcoming 78th birthday of the legendary Who singer, Roger Daltrey. And you lead off by looking back on a Who concert you went to in 1989. And at that time, Roger and Pete Townsend were in their mid-40s, and there were questions then as to how long Pete Townsend, and the Who could continue. And here we are in 2022. Roger and Pete are still bringing it on stage as the Who. So I want to ask you about a specific comment you make in the introduction, and it was about how the band was able to perform songs of youth for an older crowd by older musicians.
Going to see them at Sullivan Stadium in 1989, it was with caution and trepidation, and it was it sits in my memory as a really wonderful concert where, at that point, Townsend may have been the oldest person in the stadium, and yet he had figured out a way to make sense of how this youth music would make sense to adults. And I remember feeling I remember feeling quite struck by that. And also, the memory of the old sound of the Who, even though this was a much different ensemble, right? But the memory of that.
And that fascinated me. So I wonder if you can expand on that. And do you feel that he and Pete are still able to accomplish that in 2022?
So I haven't seen this tour, but I did publish that piece knowing that they were going to go out on tour, and I wanted to just sort of hitch my wagon to that thing. But in '89, it was a significant moment that they came back out on tour. That was also the same. That was the same summer that I wrote an appreciation of Woodstock, and Woodstock was 20 years old in 1989. So we were marking these anniversaries, and at the time, it was very. This is part of what I decided I needed to do a book about, was having been a critic over such a long stretch of time. People don't realize how much of it was we were just making it up as we went along. Like, it looks now like, the Who have been out every couple of years for the past 50 years, whatever it is. But at the time in 1989, there was a serious question about, could they still pull off a Who concert without Keith Moon? And I forget if Entwistle, I think Entwistle was still alive.
He was still there. Yeah, because he passed in early 2000s.
Right. Could they still, because they're known for My Generation and The Kids Are All Right and Pictures of Lily. I mean, those are youth anthems, right? And the larger story of rock and roll that I keep addressing in my career is, how has the youth music grown up? And there's some acts who have have studiously avoided growing up. Rolling Stones are an interesting example of this. Like John Pareles once said, what Mick Jagger is telling us is that his audience has grown too old for him.
Yeah.
He's still so intent on trying to prove how youthful he is, right? Whereas other acts like Nick Lowe or, I would say Pete Townsend does a really good job of getting older. So the idea is that these youth anthems, they have to take on new meanings because they're being played by 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds, and the audiences is growing old too, right? So what keeps pulling us back to that youth music? It's not mere nostalgia. It is not, I wish I was 17 again. It's more complicated than that. It's more substantive than that. It's that they capture something in those youth anthems that we can find metaphors for as we grow older. And it actually has changed everybody's ideas about aging, right? So that we don't, Pete Townsend, 50 years ago, he would have looked at Pete Townsend and said, he's an old geezer now. But now that is not the way people are thinking about Pete Townsend. Paul McCartney just turned 80, right? He's still filling stadiums. If you had said in 1970 that Paul McCartney would still be filling stadiums at 80, you would have been laughed out of the room. It was inconceivable. It was unthinkable. And the idea that rock and roll has taken such unthinkable concepts and manifested them over and over and over again and completely surprised us every trip around the sun is part of what makes the music and the whole culture of rock and roll really quite magical. And that's a very big theme that I really try and focus in on because it's definitely, the music has not faded in my life and it hasn't faded in many, many other people's lives too. And the artists, you can find in interviews where artists talk about, I never expected to have a 50-year career, but the audience kept coming back, right? And so there's a way that the audience and the artists help sustain one another and figure out new ways of getting older.
I think about the lyric, I hope I die before I get old. And I believe Pete Townsend, I think it was around that time, late 80s maybe, where I heard him or read a quote from him saying that meant getting old up here in the mind or in the heart and the soul. But I wonder if that's what he thought when he first wrote that lyric. Did he always think of it that way? Or did it change in his mind over time?
I think it did. And I think when he wrote that lyric, getting old meant one thing. And now that he's gotten older, getting old actually means something new, right? Getting old does not mean getting stale. This is what it meant to the young person who wrote that lyric. It meant an end of possibilities. It meant an end of an imaginal creative existence. It meant an end of participating meaningfully and actively in the world around you, right? And that was the rock and roll rebellion. And Townsend is really quite eloquent on this. A friend of mine just put in his newsletter a Townsend quote that was very, very spot on about how the larger curve of rock and roll is about those kids rebelling against their parents who were really shut down by World War II. And the trauma of World War II lingered in such profound ways to those parents that the youth revolt was pretty much inevitable. I mean, we look back and we say, well, of course the kids were revolting. They were expecting the kids to be teenagers and not engage in sex.
And the generational gap was so much wider back then than it is now.
Right. That's what we're talking about here, right? So the generation gap is very different now than it was back then. And people like Pete Townsend, I mean, this generation, I kind of look at Russia as sort of still stuck in this mold, right? Putin is a World War II survivor, and he's sending his kids off to war. He's betraying his sons and daughters just the way America did with Vietnam, right? That was a key piece of the generation gap, was that the fathers were betraying the sons. They were sending the sons off to an immoral war with no legitimate, respectable motivation, and the sons were revolting against that.
So this leads me to the next point, and we're staying on topic of getting old and still rocking and rolling. And another episode you put up recently titled Enigmatic Negation, Bob Dylan's Love and Theft, originally written for Boston's NPR news station WBUR, and listeners can also read this review on your website. you comment on his album Love and Theft, which was released in 2001. And it's hard to argue that Dylan's early work in the 60s and the 70s ranks above that of his 80s, 90s, and 2000s releases, but that isn't to say that he hasn't had some standout work during that period. Time Out of Mind, I love, from 1997. That is an example. Not Dark Yet, Standing in the Doorway, a few of my favorite Dylan songs. But you say that album as a whole isn't a great piece of work, that it was producer Daniel Lanois who saved it.
And Time Out of Mind wasn't so much a great piece of work as another rescue job by Daniel Lanois, the U2 producer who made Dylan's embittered, self-pitying laments sound listenable, like he had on 1989's Oh Mercy. Quite a few critics who praised Time upon its release admit they don't listen to it much anymore.
What is your opinion of Dylan's later work up until 2020's Rough and Rowdy Ways? Because he just had one out a couple of years ago, which includes that near 17-minute track on JFK, Murder Most Foul.
So here's where I'm going to get in a lot of trouble.
Okay.
I have a very different opinion about late Dylan than most others. And there's a lot of people who, he just doesn't, for me, he doesn't ring the bell as much as he does for other people in late Dylan. So Love and Theft is a significant moment for me because it really knocked me sideways. I thought it was up there with Highway 61 as like one of his great pieces. It had a lot of jolt to it, a lot of energy, a lot of very surprising and wayward kind of lyrical flash and fervor. And I really didn't expect it. I had sort of given up on him, and I'd been to see him one too many times when he just was really lame and like Dylan was like having a hard time growing up. Dylan has not been like the superhero of the rock iconography in terms of aging in my book, but he has still pulled some rabbits out of his hat. So Love and Theft was one of them. His radio show was another one. His memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, is another one. It's a really fascinating piece of literature. It's beautifully written. It's beautifully crafted. Nobody expected him to finish a memoir. But, the only evidence we had was Tarantula, right? And that was a fiasco. Like, nobody's ever read Tarantula. It's unreadable. So, the final thing that he really turned my head around was he did his Sinatra recordings, the triplicate recordings, where he goes back and sings Tin Pan Alley songs. And I just think that session is massively great. I still listen to that session. Now, I have good friends who are Dylan heads who really just don't like that. They think he sings out of tune. I just don't hear it. I hear him singing right in tune, and I hear his reverence for that material in a striking new way. I just would never have guessed that some of my favorite Dylan recordings would be these late period Tin Pan Alley recordings. It never would have occurred to me that would happen. And I reach for those recordings constantly. So I have a different view of how late, what I like about late Dylan. And I'm very impressed with him that he's still on stage. He's like McCartney. He's like a pure performer. He feels most alive on stage. And I'm sure there's room for disagreement along that because I have stopped going to see him. And I hear from people I respect that some of these shows are great. But for me, Rough and Rowdy Ways was not, it did not really do much for me. But I was a little bit offended by, and I use that word very carefully, I was offended by how in the middle of the quarantine, Dylan wanted us to go back and revisit the JFK assassination. To me, it just was like, it was so supercilious. It was like the whole globe has gone into quarantine, and you want us to bow down again to the God of Dylan and reaffirm what a great songwriter. To me, it was just like so tone deaf, so just a misfire. I just think what are you thinking, And I would never say you shouldn't do, you can't do a JFK song in the middle of a global quarantine. But it did seem to me like it was a misfire. It was mistimed. He lives in this bubble, and there's times when he's so out of touch with reality. I find it really, I find it disrespectful. I feel like he's disrespecting his audience.
We should mention you wrote a book on Dylan, which people can find on your website, timrileyauthor.com. Hard Rain, a Dylan commentary. That came out in 1990, right?
1992.
92?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there an expiration?
Long time ago.
well, yeah. I want to get into your early days as a writer. We'll get to that. Is there an expiration date for an artist when it comes to recording new music? Bruce Springsteen comes to mind. An album like Western Stars, 2019, I really liked. Is there an expiration date?
Well, no, I don't. I think that's part of what rock and roll is pushing against, is that there is no expiration date. I mean, as far as I know, the Western Stars didn't do it for me as much as it did it for you, but it's not a failure. I mean, to me, it's just a weaker piece of work. Springsteen is very interesting how he turns in sort of mixed bags. You know, the first 14 years, Springsteen was totally A and A plus material. It was a long stretch of incredibly consistent work. And my theory is that after he stops working with John Landau as a producer, the work really goes down a notch. And I'm not really sure how much of a correlation is there, but to me, it's very striking. The stuff that John Landau produces is pretty irreproachable. And the later stuff that he doesn't produce is not. Now, he is archiving all this stuff. There's great Springsteen live archive stuff coming out now. And, you know, I didn't get to go to Broadway, and I heard those shows were great, and they sound like they were great. I have seen him live acoustic. He's really something live acoustic. But what rock and roll, I think, is teaching us, if you take the long view, is there is no expiration date, but to try and apply the same standards for consistency and durability over 60 years is a very different thing than, say, a 7-year Beatle career. Right? Now, they're packing so much in 7 years, it's really still stupefying how much creativity goes on in those 7 years. But if you're Bruce Springsteen and you're going to carry that flag for another few decades, it is going to be full of potholes. And I do think that our expectations need to be adjusted around that. I don't think it's fair to expect great work every time out. I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that. But I also don't think that – I think our responsibility to the art as critics is to be very candid and to say this record really hits me in the bullseye zone. This record does not. And I find it interesting. There's ways in which weaker material from someone as great as Dylan or Springsteen can teach you a lot about why their strong material is strong. So all of it interests me, but I think that it'll be very curious to see what the next generation brings. If it brings more consistency or durability or less, you know.
I worked in the radio business right up until 2-3 years ago, and I distinctly remember that point where, and it was a classic rock station that would play new music from the legacy artists, as you call them, and then that stopped. And then I remember Bruce talking in 2007, that song Girls in Their Summer Clothes, and he said, I wrote that intentionally for radio, and I thought for sure it was going to be a huge hit, and it wasn't. And then I remember Aerosmith, Music from Another Dimension. There are some songs on there that could easily have been hits before. But that was the point where you start to realize, does the audience even care anymore? As a whole, you got the hardcore fans, you got the ones that are always going to go out and listen and go to the shows. But there was that turning point when things just changed for these legacy artists where it was like people just say, just play the hits. Like even I know somebody who loves Neil Young, listens to him every day. I said, he's got a new album out called Barn, I think is the new one. He goes, yeah, I listened to it, but I love the old stuff. Like, what?
Well, there is some really interesting brain research, neurological research that shows that the music that you sort of invest in as a kid, when your brain is forming, while you're forming your identity up to the age of 25, right? There is something going on in the brain there that is really quite different than the rest of the music you absorb the rest of your life. So it makes a lot of sense that the music that you're very fond of when you're a kid really stays with you. And this is just a chemical thing, right? And I sort of buy into that. But I would make a distinction between how the direction radio has gone and the direction the audience and some of these artists have gone. You can hear that Springsteen wrote Girls in Their Summer Clothes for radio. And I would say that's much more reflection on the state of radio than it is Bruce Springsteen. I mean, radio just is radio is not what I would call like a responsive medium. I mean, for a long time, for over 30 years, right? I mean, Nirvana did not break out on radio. They broke out on MTV. I mean, and that's a very old argument. And so has radio gotten back in touch with the rock audience since Nirvana? I mean, you'd have to show me an example. I can't think of one. So I don't think of radio as being, I think of radio as being really, really locked down hard. And I did a story on, I forget what it was, but I talked with a DJ, one of these program managers, a long time ago, and he said, yeah, it's very well known in the industry that Led Zeppelin tests poorly. And, it's just like, and he says that everyone knows it, but everyone still plays them because they're an audience favorite and they sell a huge amount of records and everything. It's like, if you've got a major rock and roll act like that and they test poorly, guess what? There's something wrong with that test.
I know.
I mean, but radio acts like, oh, we know what we're doing. It's like, no, you don't. No, you don't. Nirvana had huge hits once MTV exposed them. Right? But radio had the same records lying there. They just wouldn't jump on them.
Yeah.
So I don't give a lot of credence to radio program managers.
Yeah. My friend in radio, he still works in radio to this day. He brought up a good point that the programming is just based around listening time. So now the listening time is like 20 minutes tops. Maybe it's even less than that now. And so when you get these things in the mail to say, what do you listen to between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m.? What do you listen to between 10 a.m. and 2 or 3 p.m.? It's all tweaked just to get the best numbers. That has nothing to do with putting out good. So the person who's listening all day, I used to get calls from people that are like, please stop. I can't listen to Stairway to Heaven anymore. but you can't explain to them like, well, that's catered to the person who only listens for 20 minutes a day. It's like, well, what about the one who's like loyal to your station? They're there. Give them some. I could go on.
This is a very good talk. These are the bean counters, and it's sort of an engineering mindset that you can quantify this stuff, and you can't. I mean, you can do the testing and run your station by the numbers, and you will succeed, at a certain level. But nobody has ever put these up to the ultimate test, which is let's put you back to back with Freeform and see who does better. And they act like it is quantifiable and empirical, the programming they're doing. And there's very little empirical about it, but nobody ever challenges them on this.
No,
I would like to challenge them right now on this, but radio is such an old time.
I know.
Why are we talking about radio? Radio's old.
I know. Let's move on. How about let's talk movies, music biofilms that they've become popular, like the ones on Freddie Mercury and Queen and Elton John. And there's a film on Elvis with Tom Hanks as Colonel Parker. That's due out soon, if not maybe this weekend. I don't remember. But how do you feel about these types of films? Are you a fan? Do you prefer a documentary over the Hollywood makeover versions?
I much prefer documentaries. But even we're in a golden age of documentaries, but that also means that we're getting a lot of dross and a lot of documentaries, like there's 6-part documentaries that need to be just one episode or 90 minutes or 2 hours. The last really epic documentary I watched that I really liked was the Grateful Dead one. I think that was Showtime. That was a couple of years ago. And that was really very interesting piece of work. The Hollywood doesn't know what to do with rock and roll. Hollywood's never known what to do with rock and roll. Hollywood still doesn't get rock and roll right. I am very excited about this Elvis movie, but that's because it's, what's his name?
Tom Hanks.
No, the director.
Oh, the director is... Okay, so you got me. Is he a well-known director?
Yeah, Australian. Great Gatsby and, this is what aging does.
Baz Luhrmann?
Yeah, Baz Luhrmann.
Yes.
So, and Baz Luhrmann is, I go hot and cold with him, but I really respect him. And if he's doing Elvis, I'm very interested to see what his Elvis looks like. I am sure that even if I don't like this movie, there will be a lot of interesting things to think about with this movie. So, yeah, Baz Luhrmann he's not exploitative. He's a serious person. He's a serious movie maker, and he's definitely Baroque and over the top. And if that's your sensibility and you can go for it with confidence, I'm all in favor of it. I don't know what to think, but I'm definitely curious. I much prefer the documentaries. I mean, the Queen movie really was just awful, just a hideous piece of work. I could not believe what a huge hit that thing was.
Yeah,
and I haven't seen the Elton movie because I just can't bear it. I mean, it just smells too much like the same treatment that Queen got. But Queen was, I mean, just really not just false and misrepresented all kinds of things, but Freddie Mercury was so much more important than they wrote him to be. I mean, and he had such a degree of humor that is not shown in that movie, and everything. It's also self-important. That's not the Queen that I love in that movie, not at all.
Let's talk Beatles. You've written the books Lennon, The Man, The Myth, The Music, plus What Goes On, The Beatles, Their Life, and Their Time, along with Tell Me Why, The Beatles, album by album, song by song. And I want to ask you about the page on your website where you have all your podcast appearances, which is great to listen to. I really enjoyed that. You recently appeared on the Media Path podcast to talk about the Beatles and Lennon, and the title, Lennon, the Bus Stop, and What Many Get Wrong About the Partnership. What is it that people mostly get wrong about the John Lennon-Paul McCartney partnership?
You know, I think the received ideas about Lennon and McCartney are both true and really misleading in certain ways. So, you know, Lennon is the loose cannon, the cynic, the wit, the intellect. McCartney is the romancer, the charmer, the entertainer. He writes less in the first person. He writes more in the third person, right? They're very, very different sensibilities. What's special about the Lennon and McCartney songwriting partnership is that they pull off a partnership that should not work. Like if you describe it on paper, these two should never be partners because they're so different. And part of the fun thing to listen to in the career of the Beatles is hearing them go further and further apart and yet still making the collaboration work. So you have, like, on the White Album, there are no duets. They're really in very, very different spaces. Sometimes they don't even appear on one another's tracks. And then you get like a Revolution No. 9 piece, which is something that McCartney would never have done. It's just inconceivable that McCartney would do that. Never mind insist that it go on a Beatle record. That's an argument that Lennon wins. And he only wins it because his trump card is this other really weird track. If anything, it's a weirder track than Revolution No. 9 called What a Pain Mary Jane Had a Pain at the Party. And if you've never heard that, it's worth going and listening to it because he was threatening to use that instead of Revolution No. 9. So that's how he wins that argument. But I do think that those received ideas about these two sensibilities are kind of reductive in ways that are misleading. So Lennon writes some of my favorite Beatle romance songs. If I Fell, Don't Let Me Down, Julia. McCartney writes some of the great rockers, Helter Skelter, Birthday, Back in the USSR. And there is this mystery hanging over most of the Beatle material that is, so who is the main author of some of these songs? And I go mostly by who the lead singer is, although, who's the lead singer of Day Tripper? It's a duet all the way through, but who do we think of as the lead author of that song? I haven't really made up my mind, frankly. Same with Drive My Car. So I think that there's a mysterious alchemy between the two that is just forever intriguing and compelling. I'm very impressed with how long they wrote together. And even when they stopped writing together, they figured out how to keep the band going because the idea of rock and roll and the idea of the band just kept getting bigger and bigger the longer they stayed together. And I think they have a kind of a curious self-consciousness about it, that they were fascinated and intrigued themselves about how their partnership worked and where they could take it and how far it went. I'm in the Lennon camp, but I think people think that I underrate McCartney. And I just wrote a McCartney piece for a friend. I really admire the guy, but what am I? I'm just an old white guy. I'm just a critic. I don't, the idea is not to agree with me. The idea is really to just can our ideas about these people help us listen more closely, think more deeply about them? That's where a critic can really help, I think. And I really would challenge anybody to show me a line of my writing where I disrespect Paul McCartney. So, I'm very, very interested in staying fair-minded about the whole thing. I do think it's the kind of game where you choose sides. I think you're a McCartney person or a Lennon person, and I'm trying to be candid and saying I'm a Lennon person, and here are my favorite McCartney songs, and here's where I think McCartney falls short. So there's all that, and I also am very critical of Lennon. I mean, I think Lennon is he's very exposed in a lot of ways, especially working on that biography of him. He had been a hero in my life for a long time. And I can tell you after working on a biography of this guy, he's not a hero anymore. So I think it's a really, for me, it's always been just like subject number one. I got struck really early. I've always been a total Beatle head. I've read all the literature. It took me a long time to figure out that I was not, most of the Beatle heads that you meet at conventions and stuff, they're collectors. And it's a totally different mindset than being a critic. I understand that there's antipathy about critics, but that's what I am. And I really love criticism. I love the craft. I love the way it helps me figure things out. I love the way it's for me, it deepens the experience. And it's not like I'm listening critically to find flaws. It's like, I just really enjoy weighing the pros and the cons in pretty much every listening situation. And that helps me appreciate things on a deeper level. But it's definitely not for everybody. It's definitely like, so if you don't like my Lennon book, I respect your point of view. I'm not the idea is not to shove anything down your throat, right? Just take what you like and leave the rest.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is online at bookedonrock.com. Find a list of all the major platforms where you can listen and subscribe to the podcast. Link up to our social media sites. Find out the latest Books on Rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com. The well is never fully tapped with the Beatles. It just seems like we can just go on and on with books on the Beatles that can explore different things. And just like James Campion we were talking about before we started recording, who wrote the book on Hey Jude. And I thought about that, like books that just dive into one song. Yeah. There are different avenues, I guess, you can go on. I mean, are there any books on the Beatles, any area that hasn't been tapped that you'd like to explore yourself?
Yeah, I think the great unwritten book on the Beatles is, and now that we have Get Back, and I hope we'll have whatever Peter Jackson has in those vaults, although that's a big question too. I mean, they're very, very guarded about their vaults, but the amount of stray melodies and oldies that the Beatles mull over and joke about in those Get Back sessions. And we have 8 hours, right, that Peter Jackson produced from over 150 hours, I think it is. But I'd love to see a list of all of those songs itemized, and I'd love to listen to all of that. I think that's a picture of the Beatles' musical unconscious, and I'd just be fascinated to dive into that. That's a doctoral dissertation that will be very fascinating once someone dives in after it. And there will be a lot of stuff that we recognize. There's Buddy Holly songs, there's Jerry Lee Lewis, there's Little Richard, obviously. But there's a whole bunch of stuff from British music hall and from British pop music that they were growing up with in the 50s that Americans do not know about, that informs their creative bubble. And I'd just be really fascinated to chase that stuff down. I've chased a lot of it down, but really only scratched the surface. James's book it is a tour de force as a piece of writing, because to spend a whole book pursuing a single song like that is like running a marathon. It is the most challenging thing you can do. And there's very few books that do that and successfully.
Yeah,
and
he pulls it off. Yeah, brilliantly.
Yeah,
Yep.
It's a good book, yeah.
Anything about that film, the Beatles film, Get Back, that surprised you? The hidden recorder in the flower pot while John and Paul are discussing and debating Paul's treatment of George. That's one that stands out.
Yeah, we're going to be examining that footage for a long, long time. There's so much to go into there. George Harrison's off-screen stuff is very fascinating in that period. So I have a friend who did a book, All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs by Kenneth Womack and Jason Cruppo.
Talk to them both.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. And Jason is a good friend, and he's convinced that George's marital troubles were a big factor in him walking out on the Beatles when he did. And I didn't see anything about that when I was reading about Get Back as it was showing when we were all watching it last Christmas. So there's a lot still to go into. My big take on it was that there's so many things that are outside the frame that are influencing what's in the frame that if you know nothing about the Beatles, it can strike you as really boring. But the more you know about the Beatles, the more fascinating it is. So I would encourage people to read up on that period. One of the most fascinating interviews I had when I was doing the Lennon biography was I interviewed this guy, Barry Miles, who was a friend of the Beatles and who ran the Indica bookshop where he introduces Yoko to Lennon, and he runs Zapple Records, which was the avant-garde arm of Apple. It was a fascinating interview, and I had always been puzzled about Lennon's diffidence in the Let It Be movie and his remoteness and his lack of, I just consider Lennon a real voluble, mercurial personality, someone who was going, 100 miles an hour all the time. And I thought his demeanor in Let It Be was always very curious and suspect. And when I talked to Barry Miles about it, I said, was that because Yoko had a miscarriage in December? Is he still grieving a miscarriage? And he just waved me off like, oh, you couldn't be more wrong. In the way that those Brits do when they get an American author. But he said, we knew he had been on heroin all through 1968. And we were glad about it because it got him off acid. And that was like a thunderbolt quote that I could not use that in my book because I could not confirm it. But here's an insider like giving me like, oh, no, this was the attitude. He's on heroin. And so basically that was a step up. And I was like, are you kidding me? He said, well, no, actually, you have to remember in 1969 and 68, heroin was not the rock star killer that it became, right? We did not have all of these casualties. And it was rather a highbrow. It was like an upper class delicacy, right? And, that's one of the reasons people forget. It's one of the key reasons people were turned off by Yoko was that Yoko was blamed for turning him onto heroin. This is the other thing that people don't like. She was on heroin too, and she had a miscarriage on heroin, right? And for some people, we would cancel her today if that happened, right? But it does kind of show you the giant shift in attitudes about that stuff, and that heroin was not the demon drug that it became later on. But you can tell, especially early on in the Get Back footage, Lennon is very strung out, probably using heroin. And now that's just kind of considered a fact. And the great rallying that McCartney does, which at first struck me as really annoying and schoolmarmish, and I see it in a completely different light now. And actually I admire McCartney keeping the band together a lot more now than I ever used to, because I think a lot of the Beatles project was like just protecting Lennon from himself. Like he was like one of those odd figures that you have like in your high school. You can think of like, the most difficult kid in this class is the most self-destructive. He's also the most brilliant. And I think that was kind of the dynamic they were dealing with at the Beatles, and they could not be candid about it, right? You can't go and talk to interviewers about, oh, well, everything's great if Lennon would just get his shit together. You can't sort of say that, but that's what Get Back introduces us to as, in terms of the group project. And when Lennon comes around, he's so charming, right? The second half of the movie, he's active, he's talking, he's producing, he's singing, he's contributing to Harrison songs, he's contributing to McCartney songs. You can see when he's on his game, he's like, yeah, this guy is definitely worth nurturing. So it gave me a whole new insight to all of those things. And I think it's really valuable that they have released all that stuff now. I'm very curious, obviously, about what is left out of that Peter Jackson cut. I think he's a fan. I don't think that there was any censoring going on, but there's a lot of stuff still to see.
He promises to release the rest, or he's talked about it at least. Not promised, but he's thinking about it. There's a whole...
It seems to me like Peter Jackson's heart is in the right place. I just, it's Disney's in control and the Beatles are in control, so we'll see.
Talking with author Tim Riley, who has just launched a new website, timrileyauthor.com. A recent essay you posted is your review of Lenny K's new book, Lightning Striking, 10 Transformative Moments in Rock and Roll, one you recommend. Any new books you're reading now? Any that really stand out that you recommend?
Well, I just love that Lenny K book. I want to spend a minute on that because that is the most exciting history of rock and roll I've read in a long time. And it does a very dramatic thing. It shows you how much history is still unwritten. Like, I made a playlist of all of the great tracks that he raves about in there, and there's so much that I didn't know. I think Lenny K is a really fascinating guy. There are very few performers who could write a book as good as that. Very, very few. And I'm not saying he's a better person or musician or, because you can be a great guitarist and not write a book. That's all well and good. But it's very special that Patti Smith's lead guitarist has written one of our, I will call it like one of our top 5 histories of rock and roll now. And I'm going to be assigning this book and studying this book for a long, long time. It's also just really funny, full of great stories.
I'd love to talk. I think I reached out to the publisher. I was hoping to get him on. But I got to read it myself because it does look like a great read.
Oh, it's fantastic, and I'll send you the playlist that I have on it. I can't listen to it. Every time I listen to it, I think, how come I never knew this song? This is a great song. And it's not just like these obscure 50s acts where he's really great on doo-wop and R&B and stuff, but he's really great on California rock, and there's a whole bunch of California psychedelic stuff that I had no idea was so great. So yeah, there's always, history is always going to be throwing up like new stuff for us to dig into, and thank goodness it's all on it's all been recorded so that we'll be able to dive into it for years and years. What am I reading right now? All right, now I'm reading A History of Silicon Valley. I'm trying to think of my son just gave me this book Dilla Time, which is this rap producer who died very young, and I've been listening to the playlist. There's a on Apple Music, there's a Dilla Essentials playlist. It is fantastic. I cannot believe I never heard of this guy. I'm guilty as charged. I'm not a big rap person, but I do have rap tracks that I really like and rap albums that I like and people that I follow, and people like DJ Shadow and Eric B. and Rakim or the Grandmaster Flash stuff.
Yeah.
And this guy Dilla was just really blowing my mind. I can't wait to hear everything he's produced, and he's everywhere. I had no idea he was this ubiquitous presence. So that's next on my reading list.
Cool. Yeah, my dad used to have like 3 books going at a time. One before he went to sleep, one while he's watching TV. Well, how many books do you read per week or at a time?
I'm usually nursing 2 or 3 at a time.
Yeah.
I do a lot of audiobook listening at night. But I obviously read a lot of journalism because I'm teaching journalism. And I read a lot of history for that. I also just finished writing up a review of a really wonderful Russian classical pianist named Maria Yudina. And she's fabled to be Stalin's favorite pianist, which is, mixed blessing. But she's actually really, really popular over there. And it's a really wonderful history of her circle, and she was both a pianist and a philosopher and a scholar of Bach and many different things. And she interacted with a lot of really key people like Shostakovich and Prokofiev and a lot of composers that we don't know who were popular at the time and important at the time who have been lost to history. So that was a really great book by Elizabeth Nelson that I finished, Playing with Fire by Elizabeth Nelson.
Do you have any favorite rock critics or authors that you grew up on? Any that influenced your style?
Well, yeah, I think they're probably all very obvious if you read my books. I grew up, the trio of rock critics that I grew up really following quite closely would be Robert Christgau and the Village Voice and Dave Marsh. And Dave Marsh's book on The Who is very important, and his Springsteen books were really important. And then Greil Marcus. And Greil Marcus I've been reading since the early 70s in Rolling Stone. And I remember vividly reading his piece on the Beatles Rock and Roll compilation, which was 75 or 76, and he mentioned a song called I'm Down, which I had never heard before, so I had to go out and look for that. And it used to be that you would read a piece, and if a critic mentioned a song that you didn't know, you would spend years tracking it down and use record bins. And now it's all you just go to YouTube.
Yeah.
But yeah, those were, and also, I remember when Elvis Presley died, I was 17, and I remember reading Greil Marcus's obituary of Elvis Presley. And he quoted somebody saying, "The pure products of America go crazy." And this was just really like, it's been so great to follow a critic like that who's so full of ideas. And he's put together like a rock and roll career. Like his career goes over 6 decades now. So those are the three. I also really was, of course, big on Ellen Willis, very important, Lester Bangs. One of my favorite critics is Margot Jefferson, who's written the best writing on Michael Jackson is by Margot Jefferson. She's come to talk to my class. I read everybody. I read it all.
I want to ask you about, you mentioned teaching your class. So for aspiring writers listening to this podcast, what is the most important piece of advice you can offer?
It's really simple. It's just not easy, right? But the simple part is you have to read a ton. You have to read, and then read some more. And there's a debate among writers, like, does it matter what you read? I think as long as you're reading stuff that you're really passionate about and really interested in, I think you will ultimately get to the best writing. Whether you start in science fiction or nature writing or political writing, whatever it is, if you're passionate about it and you start following the threads and the breadcrumbs that every writer lays down for you, and you keep chasing it, you will ultimately, develop your taste for the writers that you really like, and it will be good writing. It's just hard to jump down the rabbit hole of reading and wind up reading lots of bad books. That's just not the way it happens, at least as I see it. So you have to do that. That has to be like a primary passion. And then you have to write every day because it's like a language. It's like a muscle. You have to exercise it and you have to do it every day. So even if you're not working on an article or a book or a piece, make sure to write in a journal. Make sure to write letters. Make sure to just really put pen to paper every single day and make sure that wheel is constantly turning in your head. And as long as you're reading, as long as you're writing, and as long as you flatter your editors, you'll do fine.
Yeah, I became a sports writer first, and they used to say, write for somebody, I don't know, remember what was it, 6th, 7th grade education or something. I don't know, but.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a common thing. Most general audience newspapers, I've had editors try and take out my big words because we write for an 8th grade education.
Yeah.
You don't want to pretend to be smarter than them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much I go along with that, but I try and write for as wide an audience as possible. And if I'm going to use a highfalutin term, I'll try and explain it as I go. But I'm guilty of writing for other critics just like everyone else.
Yeah. But I would think a lot of patience is a big thing, too, because I've always been just a short distance writer. Like I said, sports articles, I've written articles on music, but you got to have a lot of patience, right? You got to be like, okay, let's not rush this. We got some more to do.
Yeah. Well, I don't think of it as patience. So, my background is as a piano player. So I was practicing 2 and 3 hours a day since I was like 16. And it's not patience, really, because you do have to keep practicing long after you feel like it. You do have to keep writing long after you feel like it. So it's really about discipline. The idea that you're going to get up and like wait for the inspiration to zap you, that's a crazy idea. Don't just flush that thing down. It just is not, that's not how it works. You have to sit and write. And even if you're writing a letter to your grandmother, it's better than not writing. It's just you have to have the discipline. And it's not about feeling inspired. It's not about, I feel so much like writing today. There's so many days I don't feel like writing. Right? So I think of it as less patient because I'm not thinking, I better be patient with this. I'm just thinking, I know that I need to do this every day. And today, maybe I'll have nothing to show for it, but at least I'm writing.
I've asked authors in the past whether the recent advances in technology have made a difference, both good and bad, meaning that we all know what the differences are for musicians. They're not getting paid for albums and songs like they used to. You stream a song and they get like pennies. For an author, is that the same situation? Does it matter that somebody can pay less for a book on Kindle than they would for the actual copy? I don't know how that plays out on the back end when you're getting paid for those sales.
So this is a whole different can of worms, but I've written 6 books. I've worked for really big fees. I've worked for really low fees. I have never gotten a royalty check that was anywhere near a month's rent. So that's just like the starting place. Stephen King, I know he gets really great royalty checks. But so you're starting from an assumption of, so has technology changed that? Well, my assumption is not that authors ever made a great living to start with, or songwriters. They were all getting screwed out of their royalties anyway. They were owed lots of money, but could they live on what they were getting from the record companies? The record companies were busy ripping off all their performers and all their writers since the beginning of recorded history. What's changed is the delivery mechanism has made it now so like it's just a fire hose and that everything is available. And of course, they're complaining they're not getting enough. Obviously, it's unjust. They certainly should be getting paid more. But people are taking aim at the wrong target, I think. It's not really Spotify's fault that they're not paying artists more. They are business people who are cutting the best deals they can. I really fault the legacy record labels for selling out their publishing and their performers for pennies on the dollar when they bailed, when they didn't get into digital themselves, when they couldn't see this future that was screaming in their faces. It was very clear to all of us in the 90s that it was going to be subscription streaming. That was clearly what the mode was going to be. But all of the people who were in power running those record companies, they didn't have any long range vision and been no accountability. Nobody's sort of wagging their fingers at them, but they're the real culprits because those contracts that they made with the streaming services will license you our catalog were really just, it was a fire sale. It's obscene how small those deals were. And so I don't blame Spotify for getting the good deal that it gotten. I do think that it's a bad phase for the performers and the writers in the industry right now, but it's a fantastic phase for the consumer. The consumer's getting we overpaid for this stuff for decades, so now we're underpaying for it. So go figure, right? It will change. They will figure it will change.
Yeah, the business model is always changing.
They're always changing, and right now it's really ideal for the consumer. So go see the performers live. That's where they've always made the bulk of their money because that's where there's the fewest middlemen. So it is more complicated than just the unjustness of the royalty rate, which is clearly unjust. But, they act like there's no injustice in the milk industry or in the accounting industry. It's like, when people can overcharge, they will overcharge. When they can screw you on your back royalties, they're going to screw you on your back royalties. So it's in many ways, it's very much the same as it ever was. That's not that there's a lot of problems and it's broken and we need to fix a lot of things, but it's not like there were the halcyon days of, look, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, David Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, all of these huge, huge artists, they all sued their record companies for back royalties because they knew that the accounting was funky. Now, so if you're the Beatles and you have to sue, what is a mid-level artist who can't afford the lawyers? What are they going to do? They're going to cash those checks. That doesn't mean it's fair. That doesn't mean it's just. I mean, I think it's fairly obscene that your top artists, Barbra Streisand, sues her record label for back royalties. That means her record label is cheating her. So do you think they're only cheating the big earners?
Prince said, I'm a slave.
Yeah.
But Miles Copeland told me Miles Copeland has a great book, Legendary Police Manager. He said, you got to just stay ahead of the curve, man. You got to just start selling some other stuff to make money, like sell not just T-shirts and stuff. Get your own hot sauce. Get your own, tequila, whatever it takes to.
No, I don't. Yeah, I agree with that, but I don't want to minimize the hardships that songwriters and performers are going through. And as a writer, when I see pirated copies of my books, it's not thrilling, but I certainly don't. I certainly think the bigger obscenity is these giant corporations who want to give you really razor thin advances and then cut you these really weird royalty deals, and then. The people who are executives at these companies are making lots of money. I mean, it's clearly all the money is channeled upwards. So it's systematic and it's capitalism. And luckily, we're finally at a phase where people are talking about, the late stage capitalism is truly corrupt and truly corrosive, and it cannot last. It's not sustainable. So at least we're finally getting to that discussion now. That's the more relevant discussion, I think.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. What was the very first book you had published, and how hard was it to get published?
So I sold Tell Me Why to Alfred Knopf in the spring of 1985, before I had my master's degree. And that was because I taught this course for 3 or 4 years, both at Oberlin and at Eastman. And I knew I had a book because the only kind of books the Beatles had at the time were biographies, and I wanted to write a musical biography. And everyone kept saying to me, well, what's that? Like, how's that going to work? Like, nobody could do that. And like, why do we need another book on the Beatles? That's what I was getting in 1985 when I was doing research for the book that came out in 1988. Everyone I talked to said, what makes you think we need another book on the Beatles? And that book is still in print. I'm very, very proud of it. And it is like, it tells the Beatles story through the music, which to me, how come no one's done this before? I remember thinking, how come Greil Marcus hasn't written this book? Why hasn't Robert Christgau done a major long form piece on the Beatles? It seemed to me like a central subject that had not gotten the critical attention that it really deserved. That's how I felt when I wrote the Lennon biography too. It was like, what do you mean? Albert Goldman is the only American biography of Lennon? I mean, that's obscene. That has to be corrected.
How did that feel when you had that book in your hand, your very first book that was published? That had to be a huge moment for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's pretty, in my case, it was pretty anticlimactic.
Yeah?
Well, it doesn't, I mean, when you do the publicity, it really is, it's good. But so the first thing you learn when you have a book come out is how few people read, right? So you do these interviews with all these people. I did a lot, and none of these people had read the book. So they just wanted to ask me about the Beatles and drugs and their sex lives. And they just wanted to ask me all the typical things. You have done your research. I'm
so surprised. So many authors say, hey, thank you for reading the book. I was like, what do you mean?
There's no time. They can't read every book. But what really surprised me was they didn't even crack it open. I mean, they don't even read the intro. They don't even pick, like, let's go look at a song I love and see what Tim Riley says about this song. So you're learning a lot of people don't read, and you learn how, I mean, you sort of have this feeling that you have to really adjust to, which is you write the book and you sort of think this is going to change everything. And then the book comes out and it changes nothing. and it's very humbling. And you have to really sort of like, that's just the way the world works. It's not, there's very few books that come out and there's a giant roar of a response. That is the rarity. That's the exception. That's the unicorn. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very, very proud of these books, but you have a complicated relationship with them because they're static and you keep growing. So you sort of look back and you think, well, I think really I have changed my mind about Sgt. Pepper a lot since I wrote that first book. And I just am really glad I've been able to write about it a couple times since, because I think I sort of underplay its importance and its poetry in that first book. So if you read my first book, Tell Me Why, make sure you read the Lennon biography too, because I take another run at that material, and I feel glad that I feel lucky that I've been able to go back and rethink some of my attitudes towards these things.
Well, we listen to songs differently as we get older too.
Right.
That's what I love about this music. It's like I figured I'd be done with these certain songs or artists after about 10, 20 years, and then you go back and listen, you're like, wait a minute, how come I never heard this before?
Right. Aging is really a wonderful thing because you really, I have changed my mind about a lot of different things. I used to hate the Doors. I felt like it was really like, how preposterous to have a rock band with no bass player. That to me that was unforgivable. And now I listen to them all the time. I can't believe it. And I had the same with the Grateful Dead. I was just like, these guys, I'm sorry, they may be good live, but I cannot listen to them. Now I think, whoa, I love some of the Grateful Dead recordings.
Isn't that cool?
And Jerry Garcia is like, he looms very big in my mind, way much more than I ever thought he would. All his solo material, all his bluegrass.
Oh, yes. Definitely
So,
bluegrass stuff.
I love, again, it's all about following the threads of history and discovering new stuff. And we'll be catching up with those guys for a long, long time. I mean, will we ever be able to hear all of Hendrix?
Oh, I know, right? Yeah. Or you mentioned Springsteen. Stephen Van Zandt said this guy freaking writes like 1,000 songs a week. It's like,
Yeah.
He's like, I'm so jealous of Bruce. He keeps cranking out these songs.
I know.
Author Tim Riley is our guest. Just launched a new website, timrileyauthor.com. And you've got something coming in 2023, right? Millennium Pop, Music, Love, and Squalor. Oh, is this an audio-only release, or is it both? What?
It's both.
Okay.
So when I was putting together this book, I wanted to do something different. So I used some grant money that Emerson gave me, and I decided I really wanted to do this book as a digital product. So it's full color, and it's 800 pages, and it's over 100,000 words, and I'm busy tracking all of the audio for it right now, so that when you get the deluxe version of this book, you're not going to have to go get the audio version separately. It's all going to be self-contained. It's basically the ideal format for this book is the iPad. And I just felt like I wanted to do something futuristic and different. I'm very disappointed in the state of ebooks. I think the digital book right now is really a pale imitation of the print book, and it doesn't kick out the format the way it could. And it seems like to me as a music critic, if you're writing about an album, you ought to be able to click through and hear the album, right? As stop reading if you want to remind yourself what a song sounds like, stop reading and just click the link right there and go listen to the music. I mean, to me, it's like, how come no one's done this before? That's what I've tried to do. And I've tried to just really go whole hog and blow it out in every direction I can. So at the end of every chapter, there's links. At the end of every section, there's a podcast. It all links directly into the website, which has a bunch of additional resources. So it's part of an ongoing content project that I've been working on. That the Riley Rock Report is a big piece of that. So if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll start to get a taste of it. And then we launch the digital book next year. You'll have a really good idea of what's in there, and you'll have a good sampling of my approach and everything.
And you have audio entries that pretty much cover every important artist, band, or event in rock history. Hendrix, Elvis Costello, The Who, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Bowie, Zeppelin, Springsteen, the Beatles, of course, Dylan. There's one on the Woodstock film. Any standout moments or interviews or essays that you're really proud of and look forward to sharing with rock fans through this project?
Yeah, so, I mean, what I've been trying to do lately is really focus in on what the larger narrative of the book is. And so the book really is a history of rock music during my career, which starts in 85 and goes up to the present moment. And it's about the story of rock and roll and all of the different formats and the big crossover to digital that happens in that period, and how differently we think about the style and how differently we consume music now compared to when I started out, and how that all happens. When I started covering rock and roll for the Boston Phoenix in 1988, my first piece for them was the first appearance of the Beatles on CD. Wow. And of course, now we think of those CDs as really, really poorly equalized and very bad sound reproduction. And it's the 2009 remasters. Everyone says, "Oh, well, that's the gold standard now." Everyone compares. Those 2009 remasters are still like the most incredible fidelity of most modern digital mixing you can think of. But when we started to cover the Beatles on CDs back in the late 80s, this was really there was something very interesting and futuristic about it. Even though the fidelity wasn't quite there yet, you could tell this was the future. And as the CDs started to get better and better, then we started seeing things like box sets, which dominated the 90s and some of the aughts. And that really opened up history to people in ways that it had not before. So we've seen this progression of format changeovers from vinyl to CD, from CD to Napster and torrents, and then streaming, and then YouTube, which is, I'm amazed how big the YouTube catalog is. And, now we literally have history at our fingertips, and yet the dilemma is it's kind of like rock and roll. It's kind of like, well, how much does it matter? like how relevant is rock and roll anymore? And the culture in certain ways is really not as invested in rock and roll as it used to be. No. But rock and roll is still really incredibly successful. And there's still lots of great rock and roll on the margins if you go looking for it. And, that's pretty much where my listening habits still reside. Although I do love a lot of interesting experimental music and different things that push the music forward always. So I'm interested in this longer story. I'm interested in Bruce Springsteen as kind of a symbol of, how rock and roll starts as youth music and then really figures out how to be writing more and more about, things like parenthood. Like Elvis Presley was not like singing about parenthood, right? But Springsteen definitely does. In ways that even Dylan really does. Dylan doesn't really write about parenthood, right? But there's a whole body of rock and roll about parenthood that is really interesting to sort of consider as a major theme that emerges as the music progresses. So I'm very interested in this longer story, and that's what the book kind of takes you through step by step. So if you sign up for the Riley Rock Report, you'll get a deal on the digital book next year, right? So you'll just be on the list, and we'll send you information about how you sign up to get the digital copy of the book. Okay.
There is a section on your work for NPR. Who isn't a fan of NPR? It's so beautifully produced and really, and I told you before we started recording, an inspiration behind how this podcast is produced and presented. How did your association with NPR happen?
Well, I've always been surprised how much work I did for NPR because I was really a big NPR fan as a news source in grad school. And when I left grad school and moved to Manhattan, I got on All Things Considered. I reviewed Dylan's Knocked Out Loaded for NPR's All Things Considered. I could not believe that I was on NPR and reviewing that stuff right out of school. Oh, I thought I'd have to pay some dues for a long, long time. Finally, in Boston, where I was doing morning edition reports for the WBUR local stuff up here in Boston, twice a month for a long, long time. And then I jumped to Monitor Radio, which is no more. And I jumped back to NPR. So I've done a ton of radio. It makes sense as a music critic that, you get to talk right next to the music you're playing. So I learned how to do that, and that really helped. And it really helped my writing a lot, learning how to write for radio. And it helped me learn how to write for a wider audience. And I was able to cover all kinds of things that I might not have covered. So my first assignment for Morning Edition in Boston was Camper Van Beethoven. And I had this producer who wanted to say, you got to go cover this band. And I was like, all right, I haven't heard of them, but fine, I'll go. And they were big on college radio. And it was Take the Skinheads Bowling. Remember that?
No, I got to.
Oh,
no,
go look up this. Take the Skinheads Bowling by Camper Van Beethoven. And they produced some really good records. I remember going to that concert and thinking, I am so lucky. Like, I had a producer who sicked me on a band that I really, really like here. They were sort of they were a comic band, but they had really great jamming instincts, and they were sort of a predecessor to Pavement.
All right, of all the things I'm getting out of this interview, Tim, this is gonna be the most beneficial. What is it? Camper
Van Beethoven. And I doubt they even have, they probably have 8 records or something, but it'll be late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, yeah, from Redlands, California?
Yep.
Definitely. Where are you from, by the way, Tim? I didn't ask.
I'm from Boulder, Colorado.
Oh, you're
I grew up in Boulder, Colorado.
Okay.
College town, CU Boulder. And then I went off to college after that, and I've lived on the East Coast ever since.
Cool. My nephew lives out there in Boulder area. Yeah. Camper Van Beethoven. All right, so I got to check these guys out. So yeah, that is funny, man. Lead singer David Lowery formed Cracker. Get out.
Oh, interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. And one of the members joined Counting Crows. Wow. Okay. So anyway, but yeah, we were talking about your NPR. Yeah. So the NPR thing, that you were young when you were on NPR.
I was really young. I was young. I was really ambitious. I was so ambitious.
That's awesome. So we know what to look forward to with Millennium Pop. When can we expect it to be released, or do you know yet? Is that still up in the air?
Yeah, I don't know yet. That's still up in the air, but just keep your eyes on the website and on the Riley Rock Report, and we'll be talking about it. We have an edition that's sort of close to done, and then we're working on a second edition. So we're trying to think about what markets and what the best strategy is for the rollout. That's where we are now. Most of the content is nailed down, and we're really trying to figure out okay, we have our digital product now. How would this work in print? And so we're trying to make adjustments so that a lot of the same material can be used in these different formats.
And I can see here, if people go to your website, they can also follow you on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram too. So timrileyauthor.com. Right on the bottom of that main page there, you got all 3 links. And anything else? I think we covered it all. Anything else you want to let the listeners know?
It's been really a treat to talk with someone who knows what they're talking about and has actually visited the website. And I can't tell you, that counts for a lot. It counts for a lot. There's a lot of talk, but there's people who actually do the work. So I appreciate that, Eric. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And shout out to James Campion because he helped us set this one up. So I hope I have you back on again, Tim, that when this is officially out, you're welcome back on to talk about it, promote it, and whatever else you got going on, because you have a lot of stuff going on.
Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate it.
And thank you, as always, for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.